Thank you, Monica, for the lovely welcome intro slides. I always try not to sing that fight song aloud, which is easier when my mic is off. Dr. Gordon, are you there?
I'm here.
Yep. Yes. Mina Gishigad, good afternoon to you all and welcome. I would like to thank you all for joining us today for our presentation, Living Nations, Living Words, Contemporary American Indian Poetry in the United States with Dr. Gordon Henry. Before we begin, we would like to share an updated version of the land acknowledgement for MSU's campus titled Nekwejung, which in Anishinaabe-Moan is where the rivers meet. And Michigan State's campus is located in what is called Nekwejung by the Anishinaabe. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The university's campus resides on the traditional lands of the Saginaw-Chippewa Indian tribe, ceded under duress in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. Michigan State University was established through the so-called land grant system, where 10.7 million acres were taken from the 245 tribal nations through the treaty system or through force to fund and establish agricultural colleges. In particular, Michigan State was funded off of 235,193 acres of Anishinaabe land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw and the 1836 Treaty of Washington. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized tribal nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples and to the creation of equitable and fair policies for years to come. Land grant universities forcibly removed Indigenous people from their land and continue to profit off of Native students students without providing them with the necessary tools for success. Indigenous students have a complicated and isolating past and present with land grant universities. This plaque is a marker in our road to equitable advancement of Indigenous student communities. And what I've just read comes from a project that has been in the works with NASO, the North American Indigenous Student Organization, as well as other students and faculty involved in the Land Acknowledgement Committee on Michigan State's campus. And this being said, NASO is working on an official plaque with this land acknowledgement to be on campus within the coming year. So, ani gagayizigo kwen Indigenous makwandorum Saginaw Ojibwe Nindao, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, Adunjuba. To translate what I said in Anishinaabe-Moan, my name is Esme Bailey. I'm Bear Clan with the Saginaw-Chippewa Indian Tribe of Michigan, and I'm from Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And I have the honor of moderating for today's discussion. I am currently a third-year student here at Michigan State, majoring in English and minoring in teaching English to speakers of other languages, or TESOL, as well as American Indian and Indigenous Studies, otherwise known as AIIS, as I work towards my certificate for secondary education. In other words, I hope to be the cool English teacher in the future. I am also currently the Executive Board Secretary for NASO, also known as the North American Indian Students Organization, as well as the co-chair and secretary for the 2022 MSU POWA Board. Before we begin the discussion, for those of you who are new to the Zoom, I'd like to direct you to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You may use this Q&A button to submit any questions you have at any point of the webinar. We will be keeping track of your questions and be sure to address them to our speaker today after their presentation. I would also like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next few days for those who could not make it today, or if you would like to watch it back at your leisure. The only faces that will be shown today on the recorded version are those of the presenters, so you don't have to worry about your camera or your microphone. And I would like to now introduce our speaker for the day. And aside from being my lovely professor for English 354 Native American literature during this past semester, Dr. Gordon Henry is an enrolled citizen of the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation in Minnesota. He's also a professor in the English department at Michigan State University, where he teaches American Indian literature and creative writing. He serves as senior editor of the American Indian Studies series at Michigan State University Press. In 1995, Gordon received an American Book Award for his novel, The Light People, and his poetry, fiction, and essays have been published extensively in the US and Europe. In 2004, he co-published an educational reader on Ojibwe people with George Cornell. In 2007, Gordon published a mixed genre collection titled The Failure of Certain Charms, with Salt Publishing out of the UK. More recently, Henry's writings have appeared in Bob Seger's House by Wayne State University Press, a literature journal from the University of Verona, Italy, Resolución, Cuban Journal of Havana, New Poets of Native Nations, the June 2018 issue of Poetry, Wasafiri, When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, published in 2020, and Living Nations, Living Words, published in 2021. His poetry collection, Spirit Matters, White Clay, Red Exits, Distant Others will be released in spring of 2022. And I will now pass the torch to you, Dr. Henry.
Miigwech. Thank you, Esme. Really appreciate you giving me that introduction. Ani Anishinaabe, Ani Chumukanmanik, Ani Gakina, Indigenous Cause Gate Canoe, Anishinaabe Moy, Minawa, Gordon Henry, Shaganashimo, Chimigwechiwigo, Gamiz Young, Gishigud. I thank you for this good day and this good life we've been given. As Esme said, I'm from the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. Both my parents were raised there, and I lived there periodically while I was growing up. And so that makes me a citizen of a sovereign nation, the kind that are mentioned in that new land acknowledgement. And I thank you for reading that newer version of the land acknowledgement. I think it goes a lot further than the last one to do some of the things we think land acknowledgements should do beyond actual practical matters and taking things into action in the university. So as a member of a federally recognized tribe, this offers us a first point of distinction before I started talking about poetry. The term that a lot of people are using today is indigenous, and indigenous, as it was formulated in the mid-1990s, really refers to people who self-identify and then have community recognition. But when you talk about members of federally recognized tribes, they are usually people who are from tribal communities that have made treaties with the federal government and then have what is called in legal terms a quasi-sovereignty. And so we are members of sovereign nations under the law. And that's supported by the Constitution of the United States, as well as the treaty documents that inform the current status of our tribes. At the same time, we speak of ourselves in terms of the dotems as our totems that we're from, as Esme has. She's Muckwadotem. My father's Muckwadotem. My mother's from a Mississippi Band, which is a Loon clan dotem as well. So many of us who are on reservations have these multiple kinds of ways of identifying ourselves to Anishinaabe people, and then as well to the outside world. And so as you're reading American Indian literature and indigenous literature, you might sometimes have to make the distinctions between those who are members of sovereign tribes and those who are not. Indigenous is a much broader category that covers really global communities throughout the world. And so we're talking about a distinction here. And I'm going to talk specifically about American Indian writing in English by people from sovereign nations and tribes. So American Indian literature, as you can imagine, goes back a ways, but perhaps not as far as you think. The first writings in English by American Indians were actually found in the Dartmouth College Library and were written by Samson Occam, who was a Mohegan, and he was one of the founding people for the Dartmouth College. In fact, Dartmouth, when they were starting up, was actually supposed to be an Indian college. And so they sent Occam overseas to England to raise funds for the college. And he went to see the Earl of Dartmouth and raised $12,000, which was a lot at that time, or pounds. And then, but when he returned back to the United States, they changed the mission of Dartmouth College, and it became a college that was no longer for Indian people, though they sort of kept that thematic iconography as part of the Dartmouth identifying brand, you might say. But I just want to remind you again that the first writings actually happened in the 1770s, and from there on through the mid-19th century, there were a lot of books written by American Indian authors, including Samson Occam, who I mentioned, William Apes, and also John Johnson as well. And so, but there weren't a lot of them. There was a White Earth person also named William Warren who wrote the history of the Ojibwe in the 19th century as well. But it wasn't until 2010 that someone actually put together, that I can recall, a poetry collection of 19th century American Indian poetry of people from tribes. This book is titled Changing is Not Vanishing, and it's a collection of American Indian poetry to 1930, so it includes a lot of 19th century work. And there's over 50 poets in that particular anthology. And that anthology, with so many poets, I don't want to go too deeply into any of them, but I do want to highlight the work of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, an Ojibwe woman who was born in the 1800s and died in 1842, for two reasons: because we don't have time to talk about all the other poets, but also she's Anishinaabe and was actually from Michigan in the Sault Ste. Marie area. She was known as Woman of the Sound the Stars Makes Rushing Through the Sky, and she was born in Sault Ste. Marie. Her mother was Anishinaabe and her father was Irish. And later on in life, when she was in her 20s, she married Henry Rose Schoolcraft, an Indian agent in the Sault Ste. Marie area at that time. And so she wrote a lot of poetry. Some of it was published in her lifetime. A lot of it wasn't. Some of it was introduced to the writings of Schoolcraft, who also published a lot of books and a lot of cultural books and stories of the Anishinaabe from that time as well, because he had an in with the tribe, since his partner was Anishinaabe and his mother-in-law as well. So I just wanted to share one of her poems with you and talk about it. It's a poem, she's got many in this anthology that was edited by Robert Dale Parker. And this poem is written in both Anishinaabe and in English, so it's printed both ways. And that sort of foreshadows current trends in American Indian poetry as well. Whereas for a long time, people were writing strictly in English. Now we're finding a return to these dual language sets of poetry that are out there. And the difficulty in reading this poem in Anishinaabe is that Anishinaabe really had no orthography or dictionaries of ways of pronunciation. And so people often use this sort of phonetic spellings to try to get across the sounds that should have been spoken in the poems themselves. And so that became also a matter of later people developing ways of framing the language in characters that might represent the sounds in a sort of standardized way that we now find in the double vowel system that you'll see in a lot of orthographies. So this poem is she wrote on leaving my children, John and Jane, at school in the Atlantic states, preparing to return to the interior. So I'll try to read as best I can in Anishinaabe, but it will be not a very good rendition in that regard. And then I'll read the translation. Nianinda dinandam mekayan enda nakian wasa wakamik enda nakian nindanis anse ninguesis anse ije nagan agwad wasa wakamik shigwago shawin bosha wariwe nije kawaye ije ishaya yan enda nakayan enda nakayan inje keweye ishke wayan neya negush kingdom. So that's in the Anishinaabe language. It was written in 1838 and published in 1851. The translation is, as I'm thinking, when I find you, my land far in the west, my land, my little daughter, my little son, I leave them far behind, far away land. But soon it is close, however, to my home, I shall return. That is the way I am, my being, my land. My land to my home, I shall return. I begin to make my way home, but I am sad. And so this early writing by American Indian writers, including Johnson Schoolcraft's work, really is something that had been overlooked for a long time. So Robert Dale Parker's collection is probably one of the best ones you'll find with that literature, though you will find some earlier text. And there was some work that goes into actually producing something like that. They had to get some people that could actually translate those words to produce a 2007 version of that poem for publication. So since that time, there was kind of a gap, I would say, until 1969 when N. Scott Momaday won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. And that initiated what some might call the American Indian Literary Renaissance. Prior to that, there were only 9 novels published by American Indian people. The first in the 1840s by John Rowland Ridge, which was really about a California bandit. And so there wasn't a lot of literature, but once Momaday's work took off and people were writing again in the mid-20th century, through that Renaissance that we call it, there were a number of anthologies, and there have been probably hundreds of them published since then. One of the most notable is called The Remembered Earth by Geary Hobson, published in 1979. And then in 1983, Songs from This Earth on Turtle's Back, which is also a book that I had my first publication in as well. And then even up into 1997, we found an all-native women's anthology edited by Joy Harjo and Gloria Bird in 1997. And like I said, most of these anthologies are too numerous to survey here, as is the poetry that's been published by so many people since then. But 3 important anthologies have come out since 2018. And the first is edited by Hyde Erdrich, a sister of Louise Erdrich, who we all know. And it's titled New Poets of Native Nations. And that came out in 2018 and features work by all American Indian writers, meaning people that are affiliated with federally recognized tribes. And that brought us into the 20th century because it only includes work, or 21st century, because it only includes work by people who have published books in the 21st century. The second collection is the first ever American Indian Norton anthology of literature, edited by Joy Harjo, Leann, Howe, and Jennifer Forster. And it's called When the Light of the Earth Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. And that was published in 2020, and it's a comprehensive work. It even includes some 19th century work by poets from across the United States. Again, all connected with federally recognized tribes, though there are some indigenous Hawaiian writers and Chamorro writers in there as well. More recently, the third collection, Living Nations, Living Words, was published in 2021, just last year. And it's part of a larger project that includes an interactive poetry map, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And it's involved, and the poetry map shows all the contributors to the volume, as well as an audio reading of their poems and a commentary on the poems after the fact. So it's a really remarkable thing, and it's part of Joy Harjo's signature project as U.S. Poet Laureate. I am here now in DC as part of that closing. There'll be a closing ceremony for Joy on Saturday. And they've recorded some of us who are in the anthology to put our work in the Library of Congress. And so I was scrambling to get back to the hotel for my meeting because I couldn't get Wi-Fi in the Library of Congress, of all places. It wasn't their fault. I think it's my Mac computer that continually wreaks havoc with me trying to connect. But in addition to that, a number of people from throughout the tribal community of poets have written and done workshops on behalf of Joy's work. So for instance, we gave a reading at the Newberry Library on April 9th, again, as part of this Living Nations, Living Words initiative to celebrate Joy's tenure as U.S. Poet Laureate. And that said, too, it's been a remarkable couple of years for American Indian writers, women in particular, with Joy's being named U.S. Poet Laureate a few years ago and having that tenure extended for a year. Right at the end of that, we found out this past year that both Louise Erdrich and Natalie Diaz received Pulitzer Prizes for their work. Natalie in poetry for post-colonial love poems, and Louise Erdrich for her book, The Night Watchman. And so it's been really a remarkable couple of years, sort of affirming the place and the power of American Indian writing and literature. And it's just really been an honor for me to be part of that and to be working on that now. So what I would like to share with you today, I'm going to share some of my poems toward the end of our discussion, is Harjo's project at the poetry map that I mentioned. So let me see if I can do this. Yeah, it looks like it. And I am going to, can everyone see that? Living Nations, Living Words map there. Yeah, good. Okay, so this is the project here. It's sort of an Esri type map, and it's got a concordant collection of poetry in hard copy too that you can get. I've also got a Kindle copy that I use in class. It's pretty functional that way. So when you look, it says it's done in consultant, as a consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress. I went there. She has her own office there. They have a poetry section of the Library of Congress that I took a little tour through briefly on my way to do the reading. And Harjo sort of contextualizes this map by thinking about how indigenous people, the people of North America in particular, created different kinds of maps in various ways through different kinds of media. And so that's sort of how she contextualizes this project. And as we're looking through the map, when you come to this page where there's a map of the United States, mostly, there will also be some, I think, out in the Hawaiian Islands. You'll see that there are little pinpoints or points on the map. I'm up here somewhere in Michigan, and there are other people as well. But if we click on any one of these points, it'll bring us up a poem, and the poet, I'm having a little trouble because it's mostly my screen more than anything else. And so you'll find here Ray Youngbear, and you can listen to the poem and commentary. And I think I'll just give you a sampling of that, and you can listen to Ray's poem, and then keep that in mind if you have any questions or thoughts as well. There's a picture of him there.
Richie Huck, get me cool down wearing it. Get me cool down wearing it. Get me cool down wearing it. 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 Natana, what's up, gang? Natana, Richie Huck. The one I live with. Your traditional dance dress is beautiful. Your traditional dance dress is beautiful. Your traditional dance dress is beautiful. 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 I said to Wasagak. I said to the one I live with. My contribution to Living Nations, Living Words, a map of the first people's poetry, is a Meskwaki word song called The One I Live With, Ouija Hug. It was composed in 2005 for Wasagak, who is Stella Lassie Youngbear, my companion. Her Eagle Clan name, Wasagak, means the sun's glint on a turning eagle's wing. Not only does the song acknowledge the exquisiteness of her woodland style applique dress, oftentimes a family heirloom, it also complements Stella's beauty. Rendered musically in Meskwaki and translated poetically into English, The One I Live With signifies my endearment for a companion who has shared half a century with me on the Meskwaki settlement, our home. This song was inspired by a traditional dance dress my late grandmother and mother wore during their lifetimes. From photographs of the dress taken around the 1930s, it may have been made before, making it close to being a century old. The black velvet dress and blouse is decorated with floral designs outlined with white beads, with light blue, gold, and red beads on the inside. During our 1985 Woodland Singers and Dancers tour of the Netherlands, Stella was fortunate to wear this finery because someone long ago sat for hours, days, and months beating in the lines so that it may glide upon completion over the earth in dance. From its existence, the finely beaded velvet dress has heard so much tribal music, both social and sacred, that it virtually becomes a living element in the proper care of its beneficiaries. With that as preface, Stella's song was drafted around 2005. It was then published in the Yellow Medicine Review and the Iowa Review in 2007 and 2008, respectively. Over the years, the song has been updated through the addition of K-E, in the song start or lead vocal, which essentially means your in Meskwaki. This makes the song more personal. This song can be used as presented here in a social or tribal celebration dance setting where women are in traditional dance apparel.
So that gives you some sense of the richness of content in this book and in this Living Nations, Living Word poetry collection. I'm trying to figure out how to get back there now. So I'm gonna just stop to share for a second and talk a little bit about other things in the book. Joy Harjo also has a book in there. But as you can tell by Youngbear's poem, one of the things that we talk about in American Indian literature is this sort of relationality of things that might be present in, for example, a poem like this, but the poem is really extending outward to refer to this deeper and richer kind of relation, not only to the dress, to his partner Stella, but also to his grandmother and to a certain way of thinking about what happens when those kinds of elements are integrated into the cultural life of a people. And so the dance dress itself actually, as Youngbear puts it, becomes indicative of the possibility of living in a certain way, that it's almost becomes like a living being. You'll notice also too that the poem has this relation to song, And not all the poems in the collection do. Some are more related to contemporary poetry in terms of contemporary American poetry. Some might more related to narrative style, but Youngbear's poem, when we first hear it, might not speak to our sensibilities of what poetic language might do, but the deep repetition of the poem indicates back to us one of the sort of founding aspects of poetry, that this repetition somehow empowers the speaker to produce a work or language that signifies the importance of what they're talking about. And so repetition and song are sort of integral and primary, have a primacy in American Indian literature by some writers. By the way, I would encourage you to read Ray Youngbear's work. This is not indicative of everything he writes. He's a tremendously varied writer in the way that he writes and in the things that he writes about. But he says that he writes first in Meskwaki language and then translates that into English. And so he's doing the reverse of what a lot of people who are writing dual language poetry do now. That said, there are over 40 poets in the book. You can click on any of the map points. You can find it pretty easily with a Google search, and it will give you some really strong senses of how people are conceptualizing their poetry, foregrounding or backgrounding that not only in cultural history, but sometimes in the politics and social justice issues that might be relevant to their tribal lives or to their experiences as Native people. That said, I'll just hold on to your questions for a bit. I was going to read a poem by Joy Harjo, but I think, in the interest of time, I will also say that most of the anthologies that I've mentioned here, I've had a poem or two in those. And so I would just like to close my portion of this discussion for now by reading a few poems from my new book, Spirit Matters, Ismay mentioned, White Clay, Red X's, Distant Others. And then read a piece that I like to close almost all my readings with as a kind of a prayer spoken by a character in a short story. So this book, Spirit Matters, a lot of it was written during COVID time. A lot of it has to do with what people like to call historical trauma these days, but really has to do with just sort of fictionalized versions of relative relations in place in Minnesota and the White Earth Reservation. And so it has a series of letters to what are called X's or relative X's, that is relatives who are named X, as well as some passages of interludes to break up the sections of the book that refer to specific kinds of thematic elements, one in particular with all water poems in the middle. So there's like a river flowing through it. And to a large degree, I'm indebted to the work of Basil Johnson, an Anishinaabe language teacher and writer out of Canada, who wrote a book called The Manitous, The Spirits of Anishinaabe Stories. And in one of those stories he wrote about, sort of translated in some ways, the story of Chiabus, one of four brothers of a woman named Winona. And everybody knows some of the four brothers, at least one of them. Everybody who's familiar with American Indian literature knows Nanabuju, who is Chiabus's brother. And they might know Majikawis, who was the oldest brother. But each of the brothers brought some culture to the Anishinaabe people. The first basically helped people to learn survival skills, hunting, and so forth. Nanabuju was a trickster and is probably the most widely referenced spiritual mythological being in American Indian Anishinaabe literature. There are thousands of stories about Nanabuju, some in translation, some not. But I chose this Basil Johnson's character Chiabus as sort of the foundational character of my book. Chiabus was different in this way because, as Basil Johnson tells it in the Manitous, Chiabus, people thought Chiabus was strange because he would sit still for so long. And so in that sitting still, they didn't know what to make of that. And for a long time, he'd do this, he'd just go sit somewhere and he'd be real still. And finally, somebody figured out that he was trying to communicate with the people who had passed on the other side of the river. And so he was in this stillness trying to communicate with the dead. And in doing that, he brought back music to the Anishinaabe. He brought back certain instruments that we still use. And so I was thinking about Chiabusi forms a kind of a frame for this book. Though most people, when they read it, probably won't catch that. It's just my way of sort of conceptualizing what I was thinking. And there's a lot of sort of what we call traumatic elements in it. So I'm going to read the first poem, one of the first poems in the book. It's untitled, and I'll just start into it. The story you wanted to write is on fire. Paper lathered with bear grease floating down a river. Your aunt on the other side of the river, a phone to her ear, chewing gum, howling obscenities into a mouthpiece, under thunderheads, emerging in shapes that will inspire names of children yet to know language. The other end of your piece, your grandfather, underground in a funereal shadow box, surrounded by liquor glass, a few jagged bottle bottoms, throats broken from empties, the rest crushed stars of ice, brown grain belt toenails, curved claws of windshield glass blown open from some long night of lost impact, an abused blue Buick carrying a body heading for the Star Road afterlives. The container and the uncontained, reshaped like memory itself, pieced chaotically in chips and mounds of images, too treacherous to touch, too sharp to hold, too broken to make out the scene, they're shining less so, if they even show anything but how the moon or sun still move across the time-wrought surfaces we are and have been on the way to submergence, a deeper drawing down of face into glass, glass and eyes, eyes lost in fixed gaze of some turned over interior, seeing may never come back from. I'll read the next sort of trauma poem as well. It's called Relative X, a white clay tabernacle of grief. Of longing, unwrapped parcels of lost joy, survival school books, margins with poorly drawn broken hearts, empty mirrors, wash basin in rear view, useless timepieces worn down to a last hour, an interval less than a stop second. Tobacco ties, bowls of beads for unmade giveaway Thunderbirds, BIA check stubs, a glass ashtray your mother threw at some deer hunter shadow of betrayal in the doorway, a hissing recording of Ring of Fire sung by the Army vet face on the drunk punch wall, who waved the gun at us last Christmas, then set fire to his own childhood regalia. There's an unblessed host in there too. A book of matches from some white bar in Walker, Park Rapids, or Wadena. A poorly developed photo of a blonde from Anoka. A page lifted from the invisible musician, a baseball cup. A Kennedy $50 from a confirmation sponsor. An illegal prescription for persistent pain, an illegible prescription for persistent pain. The dried white chrysanthemum, wedding flower, a bullet from the pistol your aunt threw into the white clay river after your grandfather died, a singer's drumstick from the drum with only one living singer left. So this book came to me in little bits and pieces, and it's, you know, like much of my poetry, very image oriented. And so I told you I had water poems in the middle, like there's a river running between the different parts, and there are different parts and characters on both sides of the river running through the middle of the book. And so this poem is sort of one of the center river poems in that section, in that interlude. And the poem's titled The River Tells, Sings to Us Sleeping. Fox on the right bank before willow, low flying crow across ever flowing glisten of our many faces, leaping autumn spawn, the language of strangers upstream, something about a moon cast echo of a singer on a bridge, a canto of blown smoke, with a syntax of floating bodies and undisclosed submersible consonants. This is where you may swim. This is where you must not. A silent swirl here. A man and woman on a red blanket embankment together. A woman looking into stiller water for a past among floating leaves. I have taken children. I have delivered relatives. Downstream from portages and dams, a mother with an offering to always every sunrise, derelict sunrise. We have accepted another small craft, washed out bear tracks with a wake of a white canoe, early moon at the bow, late sun stern, tales of missing bodies and boats turned over, log rolling narratives, ice jam explosions, torches and spears, the lunge of brown fish, their sunstream variant color, the pull of line, a stone's throw splash, underwater gleam of small change, the entry of face wash hands, a skimmer's touch beneath a dragonfly circle, the sand full lens of a cannon caressed by fingers of weed, the hardness of protruding rock at heart-stopping rapids, a tuber's beer can flying toward the two blue heron priested shore, a hand on lantern drawing nearer to this voice, a child looking to cross an archipelago of stones, a wine-soaked teenage poet from the left bank, cursing loneliness, a leather notebook turning over in cedar leaf rapids, words illegible, a few unbound pages separating, a zodiac picture pouring star-tailed myths into all we witness in slow, continuous passing. I was going to read one more piece, but I think I'll stop there and leave a little time for conversation or questions. There's much more to say, of course, about American Indian poetry. There's hundreds of Native poets. I've been to events like this one in DC where, there's now younger poets, 50 or so younger poets here doing workshops with some of us older poets, mentoring them and helping them negotiate their lives as poets if we can ever do that. And I've been to other events in the 90s where there were like 300 Native poets. So there are a lot of writers out there, and I would encourage you to explore first the introductory volumes I mentioned, including Living Nations, Living Words. Just open it up to Q&A or questions if you have any at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Jamie Gwetch, professor. It's not the first time I've read your poetry, obviously, but having it read by you the imagery is breathtaking. I can say that. So I guess my first question, or our first question that we have, is dealing with Living Nations, Living Words. And we read this book in our course this semester. And I've always wondered what your favorite piece from that collection is, or if there's one in particular that you think of more than the others.
Yeah, that's really a tough question because I think we went through a couple in class, and every time I listen to the poems, especially when they're read aloud, I sort of change that. I mean, it's kind of like as a joke, I used to ask my friends and relatives, "What's your favorite movie?" Because everybody says, "Well, I have one now." But one of my favorite poets is Ray Youngbear. I've been a big fan of his for a long time, and likewise Joy Harjo. She just has this really strong sensibility about this, what I would call a mystical connection between where her poetry comes from and her experiences also are sort of informing a lot of her poetry, including just, the things that she sees as important social justice issues. And so I think this is really, for me, it's just hard to say, but those are two of my favorite poets. I also like a Cheyenne poet, lesser known, named Henson, who when I first started writing, I met in Michigan. He came to Michigan to do a reading, and he writes these beautiful sort of Federico Garcia Lorca lyric poems, and is actually influenced by Lorca. And so I started sort of imitating his style when I first started writing really short images poems with trying to sort of capture that moment of stillness in the poem. So yeah, tough question. I can't answer it completely.
It is a tough question. Great answer though. So there's a question from the audience. Can you say more about the nature and history of trauma poems?
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, I think people are using that language more today than I ever remember when they came out. I mean, it was that people just wrote things and then people, found trauma in them. It's hard to for me to characterize them, but they seem to be dealing with sort of life experiences that cause trauma for people. And in Joy Harjo's case, in her poet warrior memoir, she writes a lot about that and how poetry and art actually sort of helped her work through that kind of personal trauma. That said, a lot of people are resistant to it now. It's sort of what they call trauma porn, where people are fascinated by trauma, and so I think that's always changing too. One thing we don't want to dismiss in all of this is the great sense of humor that American Indian people carry in their poetry as well. People that are able to write about tragedy are also very much able to write about things from a humorous perspective, and you'll find that as well in Ray Youngbear's work, in the work of people like Gerald Visner. And my family says me too. Sometimes I can be pretty funny, but I don't really place much stock in that. So I think it just has to do with people, sort of trying to reconcile their past and history. And there's historical trauma, there's personal trauma, and I think the historical trauma is what a lot of people are more interested at this point, perhaps.
Yeah, I could personally agree with that. There's another question from the audience. Can you tell us more about the relationship between the spoken word and when a poem is rendered into a chant with music, or in general, the role of different kinds of sounds, especially music, in the lyric poetry that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think there are different kinds of sound in poetry, of course. There were some early anthologies of American Indian poetry which were just translations of traditional songs that I'm not really talking about here, because I'm really thinking about work written by American Indian writers, not translations of songs that anthropologists or ethnographers found. But there are numerous examples of that as well. So that connection is there. And as I said, there are elements in poetry which pay attention to the kinds of things that I think that songs do, that they include repetition, hearing the sound of words, sometimes that complemented by the voice singing, or by the drum or some instrumental rattle, perhaps even in some cases a flute. Some people read to those kind of things. So I think that there's that clear connection, but in contemporary poetry, perhaps sound is a little bit more subtle, and I think that's the way my poetry works. While it works through image, it also works through subtle kinds of sounds, consonants, assonants, and end sounds, not necessarily the rhyme or direct repetition that might be most apparent in songs. And the Anishinaabe tradition of dream songs too, in the recordings collected by Francis Densmore that became recorded on wax cylinders and then were held in the Library of Congress, and now have been redistributed all over Indian country. That's another song tradition too, which are sort of more like, these dream songs are more like personal moments of experience in the very short passages. And so that tradition is there in the poetry of almost every Native poet that I've read and encountered, for sure.
Yeah. So I keep referring back to class, but we discussed so much that was so interesting to me that I figured I should involve it a little bit with this conversation. We've talked about so far in the past 50 minutes about trauma poetry. We've talked about your work, your experience, and other poets and authors and writers from Indian country that have inspired you and that you've worked with. So how do you think, for you personally, does your Indigenous perspective play into your writing process? Like, are there certain things that take precedence topic-wise when writing considered your identity?
That's a really good question. I think it can at times. Sometimes it's more pronounced or more in your mind or conceptualized as the starting point for a poem than other times. Mine almost always starts with a sort of image of place, and then the sound of a phrase, and then the the cultural material will sort of unravel or unroll from that. But, you know, I think it's different for almost every poem in some ways. There are times, like if you read my poetry, you'll find allusions to the kinds of cultural experiences that I've had in terms of ceremony, in terms of being involved in treaty rights battles, you know, things related to ricing, just cultural elements that will pop up in most Native poets' work, or any poet working from any culture, perhaps. Those cultural elements will show themselves, and that's how it works for me. I don't start by saying, well, I'm going to write a poem that you know, conveys a certain sense of indigenous knowledge. It just doesn't work that way for me. I think first of place and image, sometimes then of family. Sometimes I get a sound, to catch a sound going by, and that becomes the starting point. But ultimately, there will be some cultural elements and references you'll find in this book in particular that are very place-based, specific, and culturally specific. So, yeah.
That's really neat. Thank you for sharing. And looking at our attendees, I don't notice any names that may be a part of the Indigenous community here on campus, though I could be mistaken. And so for non-Native people interested in Native American literature, or in general, taking the veil off to the reality of the situation, what would you suggest be good steps in terms of discovering poetry, literature, or other, I suppose, writings in general?
Yeah, I think, well, one way is to take a class, of course, but if you're not a student, then that might not be the best way. And of course, there are always books, and I think it's also a way of learning how to write too, is like read good poetry, read the kinds of poems that you like, try to in some ways imitate that in the beginning, and then go from there. But there's such a wealth of material out there now. I mean, even, you know, basic searches of American Indian literature and poetry will lead you to the most recent publications. And then invariably in those works, you'll find something that perhaps you connect with and want to know more about. And that will be another way. You can also go to poetry readings when they happen again, as they are now, and hear the voices of the poets themselves and listen to how they read, the kinds of commentary they might have about their own poems, and let that be an introduction as well. I don't think, you know, I mean, it's all great on the page in some ways. I mean, and if you read my book aloud, it's be a lot different than it is on the page. It can be sometimes a little bit obtuse, I guess, if you just read it on the page and try to comprehend it that way. But when you start to read it aloud and hear it, you start to get a total different feeling for some of these poems. And so I think I encourage people to do that too. Get a book, read it aloud, and then you'll know what the sounds are coming out, what kinds of sounds are coming out of it. And you'll maybe also raise questions for yourself about the cultural elements in that work. Great question.
Lovely. Though. Yeah. It's all about exploring. Don't be shy to ask questions either. So Chimigwech, Dr. Henry, I've been keeping an eye on the time, and it looks like it's almost 5 o'clock, and we want to respect everyone's time boundaries. With that being said, I would just like to once again thank you for speaking today. I know that I have truly enjoyed hearing your thoughts further on the topic of Indigenous presence in the expanding world of contemporary poetry, as well as the great work that you have done now and in the future. And I would also like to thank our attendees for taking the time out of their day to watch. It means a lot to have so many donors and alumni that care about the wonderful work and research being conducted within the College of Arts and Letters. I hope all of you have a great day and great rest of the week, end of the semester, and of course, go green.
Oh, thank you.
Chimigwech, everyone.
Chimigwech. Thank you, Esme.